Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the Hudson Institute on this rainy Friday. My name is Rebeccah Heinrichs. I am a fellow here at Hudson Institute. I actually specialize, I write and comment on all pretty broad area of topics in national security and foreign policy, but I specialize in counterproliferation, missile defense, nukes, that sort of thing. I also sort of dabble in, other sorts of WMD concerns, which has kept me sort of really plugged in on the Syria issue with Assad's use of chemical weapons. But today we're going to do something a little bit different here. I'm also a contributing editor of Providence magazine, which is the other organization who's co-hosting this event with us today. And with that, I'm going to introduce Marc LiVecche on the end, and I'll move this direction. Marc LiVecche is the managing editor of Providence magazine and scholar of Christian ethics, war and peace at the Institute on Religion and Democracy. That does not do him justice, but that's all the introduction I'm going to provide so we can get going. And next to him, we have Nina Shea, who is an international human rights lawyer for over 30 years. Nina Shea joined Hudson Institute as a senior fellow in November 2006, where she directs the Center for Religious Freedom. And like Marc, that does not do her justice, but we'll move on here to Mike. Michael Doran is a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute. He specializes in Middle East security issues. He has a new book out, and the name of your book?
Ike's Gamble,
Ike's?
about Eisenhower in the Middle East.
So you should check that out as well. And what I'd like to do then after that, I'm gonna sort of frame the discussion a little bit here, provide a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm gonna kick it off to my panelists, have a discussion for a little while, and then hopefully leave enough time for you all to ask some questions that you can be thinking about at the very end of our discussion. After nearly 6 years, Syria remains locked in a bloody civil war while Iran and Russia continue to be President Bashar al-Assad's primary enablers. Assad's Syria offers Iran an important supply line to Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon. U.S. response to the Syrian civil war has been inconsistent. President Obama, of course, lacked a coherent strategy for dealing with Syria and infamously chose inaction after Assad used chemical weapons on his own people. His inaction had a cost, a high one. The Assad regime is responsible for at least 2 more cases after that. There are many more alleged cases of the use of chemical weapons, including weaponizing and using chlorine on the Syrian people. President Trump has made it clear that he intends to refocus U.S. efforts abroad and pursue a foreign policy focused primarily on America's interests. In his April 2016 speech on the campaign trail, then Mr. Trump, now President Trump, said, quote, "America first will be the major and overriding theme of my administration," end quote. Again, from his foreign policy address, the president said our actions in the Middle East have been wrong-headed. He said, "It all began with a dangerous idea that we could make Western democracies out of countries that had no experience or interests in becoming a Western democracy," end quote. But then the geopolitical dimensions, and then he went on to say that Iran would rush in and fill that power vacuum that existed if the United States didn't do something in the region. But of course, the geopolitical dimensions aren't the only ones the administration must grapple with now. There are also religious differences, sectarian differences within those religions in the region. The indecision and inaction, or rather the decision not to act by the previous administration, changed the balance in the region and solidified alliances that had not previously been as strong, especially between Russia and Iran. And this has had far-reaching effects on Sunni countries in the region as well. And then there are the dramatic humanitarian costs of this inaction. The war has taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of Syrians, I think up to 400,000 Syrians now. It has displaced millions, creating a refugee crisis that has been felt around the world. So, in light of the Trump administration's departure from the Obama foreign policy, I hope we can grapple with, if not solve, some of these complicated issues. And so with that, what I'd like to do is sort of right off the bat, I want to talk about this idea that sort of is brewing among some corners of Trump supporters. And that idea says that Syria is so hard and it's so complicated and it's so difficult to figure out who the moderates are, if there are any, and who the good guys are, that perhaps we should just let them deal with it, let the Russians deal with it, let the Iranians deal with it, and then after the dust settles, then we'll see where we are. Mike?
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. What you just described is how I understood what I understood the Obama foreign policy to actually be. That isn't the way that President Obama ever described it, but that's the effect of what they did. And I warmly describe that viewpoint as the Sarah Palin thesis. You remember she famously said that when asked what to do about Syria, she said, "Let Allah sort them out." And that is basically, President Obama never used that terminology, but that's basically what he did, just pulled America back. And then what happened was, as you stated, Russia and Iran filled the vacuum. And I think that President Obama, again, he never said this, but my reading of his policy was that he thought there was no problem for the United States in letting the Russians and the Iranians become the dominant force in Syria. I think it's a problem for the United States, that is the central problem. We, when from day one of the Trump administration, the administration said that they put Iran on notice and they want to push back against Iran across the region. Well, Russia and Iran are in an alliance in Syria. Certainly, I think it's an alliance across the whole Middle East, but it's certainly an alliance in Syria. So if you're pushing back against Iran, you're pushing back against Russia. And there's another issue as well, and that's the problem with Syria. The problem with the fight against ISIS is not the military problem. ISIS is 30,000, probably less now, nasty guys with pickup trucks. They're no match for the American military. The problem is the political problem, the problem of political order after the war, right? After the military defeat of ISIS, who wins the war? Who establishes the new order? And if we have the Russians and the Iranians establishing the new order, which is the way President Obama set up the system, when the Trump administration came in, well, then we alienate all of the major Sunni powers in the region, and we alienate the Sunnis on the ground. The whole Jihadistan from Baghdad to Aleppo is primarily Sunni Arab. And so the Obama administration aligned with the Russians and the Iranians, and aligned with the PYD, with the Kurdish, with the Syrian Kurdish cousins or extension of the PKK in Turkey. So that combination of Iranians, Russians, and separatist Kurds alienated the Turks and alienated all of the Sunnis. The only way we can bring stability to the area, which is what we want, I think that's what our goal should be, is to have Sunni Arab allies. So as long as we align with the Iranians and the Russians, or just let the Iranians and the Russians expand their power, we will not be able to find partners to stabilize the region. That's the fundamental strategic dilemma.
Nina, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, my focus throughout this has been, and the reason why I guess I'm on this panel is because my focus has been the genocide. And genocide of the minorities that was designated officially by the Obama administration 1 year ago next Friday against the Yazidis, the Christians, and the Shea of this area under ISIS. And basically, President Trump, as candidate and as president, has promised to keep his promises. And one major promise is, on the foreign policy front, is to be to eradicate radical Islamic terror from the face of the earth. That is an extremely tall order, and if he does that, it will help these minorities. It's the sine qua non, in fact, to help these minorities. Because, yes, it's defeating ISIS, and if you look at the whole region, you really can't separate Syria and Iraq too much. The generals are saying within 6 weeks, Mosul is going to be liberated from ISIS. And that means Nineveh, where these minorities are from in Iraq, is going to be inhabitable, theoretically, again. But we're going to have a continuing problem. It's a tall order because ISIS cells will live on. Also, Al-Qaeda is expected to enlarge and benefit from those fighters who are disbanding now and fleeing Mosul now. There's also the Iran encroachment that Mike has referred to, but in a place like Iraq, you're already seeing checkpoints with mullah in the Christian areas with Iranian-backed militias manning these checkpoints, and also Christians are reporting to us that their lands are being bought. They're being offered good prices for their former villages and homes and businesses by Shea who are flush with cash, presumably, they presume, from Iran. So that Iran is part of this radical Islamic terror. It is a terror nation. So I don't think that Trump is going to be satisfied with al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, as the deer in the hood, like Obama was with bin Laden. I think he realizes that, Obama dismissed really Al-Qaeda and the whole terror threat with, dismissing ISIS as a JV team. And we've seen how ISIS has really brought about irreparable harm. I mean, this will never be put back together like it was, and these small communities in particular are almost on the verge of total destruction. And so I think that Trump is going to do much more to keep his promise, and I think that they'll be serious about it, and I think that it'll go a long way in trying to stabilize this region so that it can prosper. It's not a poor region; it's a rich region, and so I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to let Marc have a chance here to respond if you'd like. Do you want to add on to either of the other two, or if not, I've got another question for you.
Ooh, that's enticing. No, I mean, just a pedantically obvious observation that, one of the lessons here is if you don't make the right decision early, the negative consequences that result from that making a right decision later that much more difficult, in part because other people step in, Russia or Iran. And the longer you continue avoiding or not making intentionally the right decisions, then the negative consequences continue to barrel along through history, multiplying like bunnies and making any right thing incredibly difficult, first to identify and second to do. Some things are obvious. A deer on a hood is a good start. Ending genocide is a good start. But now, how? Right? For reasonably intelligent people, and it's an intractable seeming issue. But
it's a great point, and I think it should be recalled that President Obama did have more options before him before things really started to spiral out of control. And this idea that inaction is, that sort of doesn't have its own problematic consequences, is just foolish, because as we've seen, is the choice to not do anything has made the situation far more complicated, has resulted in genocide, frankly, in the region. I want to ask about safe zones next. But before I do that, I did want to ask back to my original question, which was this idea that there is some folks in the right now in the country that believe that the situation is so hard and so complicated that perhaps we should just leave it there. And Mike, correctly, I agree with him, made the point that was in fact what the Obama administration had chosen to do. But Marc, can you explain why this idea, though, that American national interests are completely apart from and have nothing to do with the concerns, the humanitarian concerns, the ethical and moral concerns about what's happening in the region. Can you sort of explain for us a little bit why those things are not mutually exclusive, and in fact why it is? President Trump is in fact concerned about the genocide of minorities in the region. He is concerned. He was the first one, I believe, who came out in support of safe zones as just at least something that perhaps would help give relief to some of those who are being persecuted in the region. Can you just help us think a little bit about why those things might not necessarily be mutually exclusive?
Sure. In part because it's in our own best interest to be concerned about morality, right? And I think that's to remind more than it is to instruct. But it's something I think we often forget, and especially in the contemporary discourse, we traffic in binaries. You've got realism and idealism. You've got compassion or security. You've got interest or morality. And often our rhetoric renders these things sort of zero sums. You've got to be one of those things, and you've got to be it to the nth degree. But when you take a step back and you look at Trump's policies, Trump's positions, and simply the way that most people live, that's really not what we think. To get our bearings on this, I think it's helpful to look at the family, which is maybe the smallest microcosm of society. As a father, I have a interest in securing the welfare of my children. They are my first earthly allegiance. It is morally appropriate for me to be interested in securing their vital interests, right? And sometimes that's going to even be at the expense of other people. Mike, I love you, but if you and I are hiking with my children and you all fall into a pit of vipers, I'm going to pull my children out first, right? That's just how that's going to go. But I did say vital interests, right? And so that's a qualifier. I have to be committed to provide their basic necessities, food, security, shelter, Pokemon cards, these sorts of things, right? And to be committed to that almost to the nth degree. But I'm less concerned about providing luxuries. And I'm even less concerned, almost utterly unconcerned about providing luxuries if my neighbor doesn't have enough to eat. And there are even certain circumstances, to complicate it even more, where I might jeopardize or be willing to jeopardize their basic necessities in order to come to the aid of others. So we don't act throughout our own lives as if these are zero-sum games. We do both all the time. And there's much more to be said on that, but I'll leave it there for now.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm quite confident that should Mike fall into a pit of vipers, he'd probably lift them up to you. So
I think he would.
It would be a good team effort.
I want to be
I
like
would
Mike.
have until he said what he said. Now, here's my view on that.
No, that's great. I think that I also think that the Trump administration has sort of been a little bit misunderstood on this point. I think the America First, if you go back to not only his inauguration speech, but then his foreign policy speech, what he's trying to do is sort of reorient American foreign policy to think of it primarily as in the interests of the United States, where before we sort of had this idea that, humanitarian concerns are this sort of nebulous idea of what's right for the world sort of came first. And he's trying to focus that and sort of instill a little bit more discipline in our foreign policy to, of course, think about humanitarian concerns, but as it overlapped and pertained to American national security interests. I'd like to ask Mike, because I do think it's important. A lot of us here in think tanks talk about how obviously bad it would be that Iran would have this proxy in Syria and Assad would stay. But can you just explain again why that is problematic? What is the problem with Iran for those people who are just now tuning into foreign policy, who are watching at home, who are just now getting engaged? Can you explain to us why that, in particular, why would that be bad for the United States, for our national security interests?
Sure. First of all, it isn't just Iran; it's Iran and Russia. They are the two of them have a vital interest, each for their own reasons, in propping up the Assad regime and putting as much of what we might even call the former Syria now back under the control of Assad as they can. It's absolutely a vital interest of the two of them, and they have a division of labor, whereby the Iranians provide the troops on the ground, and the Russians provide the air cover, and so they have this vital interest, and they can't. Neither one can do it alone. They can only do it together. There's among many of the, I don't know what to call it, the grandees of foreign policy in Washington, the biggest thinkers, talking about, former national security advisors and secretaries of state and so on. There's a belief that you can separate Iran and Russia. That's sort of a very common foreign policy big think that you hear. And I think that is greatly exaggerated, the ease with which they exaggerate the ease with which you can separate those two. So that's the starting point. And then the question is, how does one think about Iranian power and Russian power? And I am firmly in the school that the Russians and the Iranians are out to undermine the United States in the Middle East. I want to establish a foreign policy principle. And the principle is that those countries that in their day-to-day pronouncements loudly advertise their hostility to the United States or their enmity to the United States are enemies of the United States. Right? That's what I want that to be the principle. Why do I say that? Because if you've dealt with the Iranians, I used to work in the Bush White House, the George W. Bush White House. And when you deal with the Iranians from the White House, you can see a very different picture than you see if you read the newspapers or listen to the pronouncements coming out of Tehran. And you can see it very clearly today when you look at the difference between what the supreme leader says about America as opposed to what Zarif, the foreign minister, says about America. Zarif is writing op-eds in the New York Times now saying, Iran is your counterterrorism partner. We can work together against ISIS and so on. When I was in the White House, they weren't saying that openly, but that was the back channel message. Assad does the same thing. Assad is very good about sending messages through the CIA and elsewhere that says, we understand each other. Rebeccah, you have your interests, I have my interests. You have your hardliners, I have my hardliners. Publicly, I'm going to have to say some nasty things about you, but behind the scenes, we can do a deal. And there's a certain kind of American, pragmatic, business-oriented, and so on, that really responds to that rhetoric, right? And says, "Oh, this is a guy I can work with." But they're playing us. They will pocket. They understand they're the weaker parties compared to us. A shift in our policy a minor shift in our policy can really harm them significantly. And so they mollify us by sending these back channel messages when the goal of their policy is to undermine us and to undermine our allies. And so that's why we don't want them there. The second reason is that, as I said, it's the sort of demographic reason. As long as we are either turning a blind eye to them or in a tacit alignment with them, we are alienating all of our traditional allies in the region. That includes Turkey, that includes Saudi Arabia, that includes Israel, and that includes the elements on the ground that we need in order to bring order to the region. So if you start with the principle, which I assume is what America First means, right? What does America First mean in the Middle East? Who knows? We have to figure that out, right? We don't know we don't have an agreement about what the American interest is. But if it means anything, I think it means we're not going to have another George W. Bush style invasion of a Middle Eastern country, right? We're gonna hang back a little bit. We're going to work through others. So the question then becomes, who are the allies on the ground that, if they don't share all of our interests, at least we can work with and live with, and will create an order that is not threatening to us. And that means our traditional allies, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, and so on. Those are the choices we have. So we either go with Iran and Russia, or we go with the traditional allies. I say let's go with the traditional allies. As long as we're aligning with Iran and Russia, we don't get the traditional allies.
That brings me to you. Can you explain to us how will that then, based on what Mike just said, affect some of these minority groups that you've been tracking and following
Well, I think that we should be clear that Iran is no friend to the religious other. It is one of the worst countries in the world. It's on the country of particular concern short list of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and the State Department as being, one of the worst violators of religious freedom. Just this week, it arrested two more, a mother and a son who recently converted to Catholicism, and there's been lots of arrests of Christians and Sunnis and others, even Ayatollahs who disagree with the regime, are languishing in prison and being tortured for it, if not outright killed. So, Iran is a terrible violator of religious freedom, a persecutor. It is not to be trusted, as Mike said, with the safeguard of anyone who doesn't agree with them. And that includes the small minorities. And, there's this, you raised the safe zone idea at the outset, and that has been talked about and continues to be talked about. And that can be a solution. It may be a high cost to it, but it can be a solution for the, particularly the Sunni refugees from Syria, who we've seen going in great numbers to Europe. It may be a solution for them. I don't think it's going to be a solution for the small minorities. Those safe zones will very quickly become like the UN refugee camps, where no Christian or Yazidi dare enter them. Because they are really dens of persecution inside. The persecution follows them into those places. So I don't think that the minorities are going to benefit from that. And they may find some protection in the south of the country. There's certainly going to be a lot fewer minorities when it's over. But I think that they will look to Assad for protection. And many of them are very desperate that they not be handed over to, that the country not be delivered over to a Sunni government that might quickly turn into some kind of Islamist regime like we saw in Egypt.
Great. And I'm going to come back, and since you I brought up the safe zones, and then you touched upon it a little bit. Mike, did you talk about that? Just a little bit about the
safe zones?
The idea of safe zones as at least part of a larger package of solutions for the region.
Well, that's the key. It's not a solution. It has to be part of something larger, because it's the beginning of an idea, of a strategic idea, but it's not the end. Because first of all, the question is, who's going to police the safe zone, and with what tools? So if we do it with the Jordanians in the south and the Turks in the north, perhaps. Well, first of all, where's it going to be, right? What effect is the safe zone in the north going to have on the Turkish-Kurdish balance? Who's going to police it? How are you going to create an order inside the safe zone? So you're talking about a significant. If you want to have control over it, you're talking about a significant application of direct American force and Americans, or working through proxies that have their own agenda that we may or may not agree with. And then what are you going to do to the counter response to the safe zones? Because safe zones policed by U.S. air power and maybe some special forces on the ground and so forth in cooperation with others, that is a great American muscle movement, and that will be read by the Iranians and the Russians as a muscle movement, and they will respond to it. So suppose the Russian and Iranian answer to all their problems in Syria has been to wipe out cities and push populations around and change the demography. What if they start pushing refugees into the safe zone? Aggressively, I'm talking about, moving people out violently in order to disrupt the safe zone. What if they create, what if Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the Iranians and the Russians start creating sleeper cells in the safe zones to disrupt them? How are we going to respond to that? So in order to police the actual safe zone, you have to be ready to impose costs on the Iranians and Russians if they take any step that that threatens your policy. So you're immediately in a competition with the Iranians and the Russians, and you have to be willing to win the competition ladder. That requires a very significant American force package in the region and a posture to tell them that this is the case. And just one last thought. The Iranians and Russians are not going to respond to the safe zones only where the safe zones exist. There's the Iranians are building a belt of allies from Tehran to Beirut, and they're working elsewhere in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, for example. So if our action in Syria is seen as a threat to the Iranian position, and it will be, the Iranians could act anywhere along. It's one strategic theater. And they could act anywhere. They could flood the green zone in Baghdad with Iraqi Shiite militiamen and so on. So you have to be willing to act throughout the whole theater. That means we're in a serious competition with the Iranians and Russians, and we have to gear up accordingly.
Marc, I did want to ask you. Nina brought up the problem, that Mike explained what some of the benefit might be for safe zones, but as, of course, not as a solution, but as a short-term fix. And then Nina brought up some of the problems with that, especially for minorities. I don't want to labor this point too long about the refugee crisis, and that's a big controversial subject here in the United States. But you have written about this somewhat, a little bit, about the refugees, et cetera. And can you explain your position just as part of what the United States must do for the region, just relief for the refugees that the conflict has caused, and what would be your sort of initial thoughts on what to do about that now?
Easy question, right?
I believe I would just say, should they stay there? Should we find a solution for them somewhere in the Middle East, as opposed to looking for a solution to bring them here?
Sure, and this gets back to the question of compassion versus security that a lot of people like to say. If you bring people in, it's a threat to our security, so we don't bring them in. Others say, well, if you don't bring them in, you're not demonstrating any sort of compassion. We've demonstrated over the years that there's all sorts of ways of being compassionate in the region itself. Right. I mean, how many billions of dollars, at least at the end of 2015, it was $1 billion, I think we had already spent on refugee camps. And I'm not saying these are wonderful places to raise a family, but the conditions can be made better to something that approximates, security and order and all of that. Talking to people who have talked to people in the region, a lot of people are convinced that the Christians want to stay, at least overwhelmingly so. And that's a hard ask, but if people are willing to stay, then it seems to me that it's ideal that they do stay. I have a hard time getting along with just myself, right? You start to add to that company, and it becomes even more difficult to get along. Conflict happens. So it seems that it's good to learn to live outside yourself, to be empathetic with other people, to learn to be open-minded and in certain ways broadly tolerant. And you're not going to probably learn that in the Middle East if you chase out all the minorities and the people with whom you disagree. And then that doesn't seem to be good, not just for those who have been chased out, but it doesn't seem to me to be good for the people who remain. To stay parochial, to stay incredibly sectarian is destabilizing internally, and it makes for bad neighbors externally. So yes, they should stay. Then the question becomes, ideally, how do they stay? Part of the answer to that is wrapped up in whether or not Syria and Iraq are, or ever have been, or can be real states. And when you look at the facts on the ground, the answer to that seems to point in the direction of, well, no, probably not. So then what does that mean? And can you have a decentralized, semi-autonomous region where you can try to work some of that out? Now, and this is a real question. 2 years ago, I was doing a dissertation, endeavoring to embark upon a career of general irrelevance to everybody else, that I was hired to run a journal that intersects Christian intellectual tradition with national security. And so I played 2 years of catch up and trying to be practical. So one of my questions for the panel, if I may ask a question, is are safe zones the same thing as these decentralized local governments, based on the Dayton Accords? We've had a number of people write for us saying, Bosnia is a great example of what might be able to happen in some of these areas on the Nineveh Plain, et cetera. Are we talking about the same thing when we talk about safe zones versus these kinds of semi-autonomous, decentralized zones, which even the Iraqi PM seems to think, if the center doesn't hold, you either decentralize or you disintegrate? Is that the same thing? Is that something different in your minds? Is that more viable, less viable, equally? So,
Yeah.
Go, Nina. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because these terms are used interchangeably. Like safe haven is another form of describing this. And I think what the international community seems to think about Syria is that safe zones will be for those refugees flowing to Europe. And those refugees are mostly Sunnis. So I think that's who those safe zones will be in Syria. I don't think that the minorities and the others who are not, the Shea or Alawites, will be able to enter them and live there, just because they can't do it in their cities now. And in Iraq, it's somewhat different. The Nineveh Plain was the area where these all the minorities had been flushed into over the years. And so you have the Christians, the Yazidis, the Turkmen, the Shabak, all these populations, and that were either ethnic or religious minorities or both. And I think that there's a challenge now to keep that safe. It's a plain, it's a natural battlefield, has no natural defenses, so it needs protection, and they really don't have their own militaries to do the job. So, but, you talked about compassion in addition to defense, which may flow from a continuing U.S. military presence to keep down ISIS, to keep down Al-Qaeda, and keep out the Iranians. That they may get that, be collateral defense from that. But then they need, they need compassion. They need help, and they've needed help all along. And these minorities have not gotten, in some cases, any UN aid. And they have not been able to avail themselves of the camps, for example. As I mentioned, they have not gotten the Chaldean Catholic Church, which oversees all the camps in the Erbil region in Kurdistan, where most of the Iraqi Christians fled from ISIS, the genocide survivors fled to, have testified to U.S. Congress this past fall that they have not received 1 cent in aid from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees since ISIS entered. Not 1 cent. They received some tarps at the beginning. And this was testimony before Congress. Trump has to fix this. That's not compassionate. We seem to think, the United States has given $1.1 billion in humanitarian aid to the UNHCR for Iraq's displaced since 2014. And none of that has reached most of the Christians and some of the Yazidis that are being cared for in the Erbil region. And then we have the reconstruction aid coming up as an issue. ISIS may be gone in 6 weeks from that particular area, and reconstruction is already being planned. There are no UN planned distribution centers for this kind of reconstruction aid in the Christian areas of Nineveh. They're in Mosul, where the Christians and Yazidis are not. There's one planned there's 20 reconstruction aid distribution centers planned by the UN Development Program. None of them are in the Christian areas. And when a friend of mine asked recently, this week, in fact, to the USAID, if the minorities, the NGOs could attend, if the U.S. could ask the UNDP to call for a meeting on reconstruction with these NGOs in this area of Nineveh, the USAID pushed back and said, no, that's not the role of the United States to ask the UN. These are professionals that are doing their job, and we can't intervene, even though the U.S. supplies 25% of the budget under the UN Charter. We supply 25% of the aid that they're distributing. So I think the Trump administration, whether it wants to or not, is going to have to really tend to this. I certainly hope they do, and I'll be pressing for it.
Thanks, Nina. That very helpful in laying out some of the specific challenges there. I want to go back to Mike here and talk a little bit about, though, before we turn it over to the audience. One of the criticisms, and General Mattis, now Secretary of Defense Mattis, I think has been very good at explaining, is that we haven't really had, one of his complaints against the previous administration was that there really wasn't an end state that was planned or thought through. And so this sort of, being led around by just how events were unfolding was a really major problem. We were simply just reacting rather than directing events in the region. And it's my read that that's going to change. And so we're going to have to navigate all of these problems, but still we're going to have to determine what is the end state. And you touched on that. I mean, this isn't just going to be, it's not going to be solved militarily, although there will be a military piece to this. There needs to be a political solution. We need to figure out who it is that we want to govern in the end and how that's going to work out. And I remember I was at this private roundtable discussion with some of our allies in the region right after Assad had used chemical weapons, and when President Obama was sort of dithering on whether or not we were going to actually respond to that, action of crossing the red line that he had drawn. And one of our allies in the region he said he was very frustrated and threw up his hands and said, it doesn't matter what the United States decides to do. We just need to know what it is that we want to do, and we'll get behind you. And it was sort of struck me as, it wasn't even this strong opinion about what needs to happen, but our allies really wanted strong American leadership in determining what the end result was going to be in the region. So even though we have all of this confusing, parts and components to this, and there is inevitably going to be just the fog of war, not knowing going into this, how do we then decide? I mean, you brought up, just as a matter of strategy, we have to have allies involved in coming up with a solution. But how do we do anything? How do we go in there without actually coming up with a grand strategy and determining what it is the solution that we want? Or should we expect in the months to come, that the administration will determine that this is who we want to govern, this is the political solution, and then work from the military requirements, et cetera, and work from there?
The whole question it's a vexed question, the end state, because as I said before, we're not going to put 150,000 men on the ground so that we can determine by ourselves, through our own use of force, what it is we want to build. We're going to have to work with others. So I would call for an intermediate goal, which is to put together the coalition that could possibly help you determine what the end state is, and that to me is coming up with the trusted partners who are willing to work with you, and then negotiating with them as you go along. That's the key thing. We have a pseudo coalition at the moment. The 60, I can't remember how many we have, 65, 64, 63, 68, 68 allies, right? That's, when the United States announces that it has a major, it's going to engage in a major project, then a lot of people will come and say, we want to help. You'll always get people who want to help and who will join up for all kinds of different reasons and different agendas than actually helping you achieve the thing it is that you want to achieve. And so that's why we've had 68, 65, 63 partners fighting 30,000 nasty guys with pickup trucks for well over a year, and we still have no solution in sight because they don't really want to do the job. And the reason is, at the risk of repeating myself, we are the only power on earth that thinks the destruction of ISIS is the number one priority in the Middle East. Everybody else is asking themselves, what new order is going to replace the ISIS order? Is it going to work to my advantage or not? And what everybody sees is that the United States is ushering in an Iranian-Russian order, right? Until we change that picture and show everybody in the region that that is not the order we're going to usher in, we're not going to get a lot of cooperation from everybody. So, and the one conclusion I would draw from that, let's drop the notion that defeating ISIS is our grand strategic goal in the region. Our grand strategic goal in the region is to build a new order in the region. To build a new order in the region, we need partners. To get the partners, we have to show that we're willing to compete with the Iranians and the Russians. That doesn't need that, and that means we're also hostile to the Assad regime. It doesn't mean we have to say regime change in Syria tomorrow. It doesn't mean we have to drive the Russians all the way out of the region. So we have to show that we're competing with them. We're not partners, and we want to create an order that is favorable or at least acceptable to our major partners in the region.
That's great. That also reminds me, in a conversation with one of our Eastern European allies, I asked about what the concern was about ISIS. They said, well, we care about ISIS to the extent the United States wants us to care about ISIS. But what they really, truly, and what she really meant was, we're very concerned about Russia. We're very concerned about Russia in the region. And so, it's not that it isn't a concern, but certainly for them, it's just not the alligator closest to the boat.
Could I actually have to revise what I said now. You said France wants to see an early defeat of ISIS. I think the United States, the American public expects an early defeat of ISIS, right? Sure. And so, that's President Trump's. It was his campaign promise. That's got to happen. So I didn't mean to suggest that we shouldn't, that it shouldn't be an urgent priority to actually defeat ISIS. But while we're doing that, as Marc mentioned, we've been making little tactical adjustments that have real strategic implications down the line that we have only vaguely been aware of. We need to be aware of the larger strategic context while we're taking care of this urgent problem.
That's a great point. That's a great point. We'll take in there too. Nina, I wanted to give you an opportunity too, since we are talking about short-term fixes and then longer-term solutions for the region. I thought you made a wonderful point in a conversation that you and I had recently about we still have this ideological undercurrent that needs to be addressed in some way. Perhaps the most difficult piece of this, but it has to be part of it. It has to be something that we deal with. The idea of the Islamic radicalism in the region. Did you want to speak to that just a little bit? Just want to give you the opportunity.
There's the issue of terror, which has a military solution, and we see that with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But there's the issue of radicalization, so that we're not always just reacting militarily to a situation that is going to cost hundreds of thousands of lives or wipe out entire cultures, and who are a threat to us as well. And that's the other part of it, Mike, that one reason why we should care about ISIS is because they are plotting against us. So the radicalization, we're seeing it now in Iraq, the product of it, with these children that have been indoctrinated with a radical version of Islam for the last 2.5 years. And this week, they found the Iraqi troops found letters of schoolboys in a ISIS military barracks. These were the Martyrs Brigade of ISIS. They were 13, 14, 15-year-old kids. And they went on to become suicide bombers, and they found the letters that they left for their parents. Actually, they were meant to be sent to their parents, but they never were, so they found them in the box. And the kids are talking about how one boy, 15 years old from West Mosul, is writing to his parents that he has joined ISIS. He's run away and joined ISIS because they refused to let him be married off, and he now wants to find the 72 virgins. And so this is the kind of indoctrination that these kids have gotten, and they're still around. The New York Times, if it's to be believed, said that ISIS was using Saudi Arabian textbooks at the beginning in Mosul. And certainly those textbooks have been a concern of mine. I've done three or four reviews of them over the years since 9/11. And they teach things like the blood of a Christian can be spilled and treasure taken unless they have a protection contract with the Muslim, or that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a fabricated text, is historical fact. That is an anti-Semitic tract that Jews are plotting to take over the world, is historical fact. It really happened, and these are real protocols. So, this has to stop. This kind of, this is some of our intelligence heads. I remember Jim Woolsey told me, that this is kindling for bin Laden's match back after 9/11. Is that this kind of indoctrination allows a good leader, an effective leader like al-Baghdadi of ISIS to come in and to make these kids become suicide bombers that threaten everybody. In Nigeria, we're seeing 13-year-old girls becoming suicide bombers. And when the reports I'm getting is that when you see a strange 13-year-old girl walking into the market, they'll just kill her. Either the soldiers will or the mobs will just go after her because it's happened so many times. So, that is one example of something that really needs to be tackled, I think. I don't think we can continuing have a military response for endless wars because every time we stamp out, Al-Qaeda or ISIS in one part, it is spreading elsewhere. And right now it's spreading throughout Africa, in Western Africa, in Mali and beyond, in Nigeria. And these are it's extremely destabilizing and costing many, many lives of the population.
I think it's an important point just to keep in mind that there is and I do think that the Trump administration, has made a major departure from the Obama administration, at least in even recognizing and calling out the fact that there is an ideological undercurrent that is the motivating. That's what's driving.
These aren't just sui generis terror groups popping up.
Exactly, and then of course that must be considered as we think about refugee policy and that sort of thing as well. With that, I would like to take some questions from the audience. If there are some ready, I think somebody will be here with a microphone. Get right there in the corner. Mm-hmm. If you could just state your name and where you're from, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Mary Carrick. Nobody has mentioned that under Assad, every single religious minority is protected. And if you get rid of him, what are you going to get? We've done this in Iraq, and we did it in Libya, and they're basket cases. Libya doesn't even have a functioning government right now. And I can't, okay, maybe Iran is not really religiously tolerant, but it has the second largest Jewish community in the Middle East. They're allowed to practice their religion. Saudi Arabia, you will have your head chopped off if you wear a cross. If a woman is raped, they kill them. So I don't know why there is this idea that Saudi Arabia is this wonderful place, and Turkey is not going very well with this Erdogan guy, because under Ataturk they were supposed to be secularized, and he's bringing back all these very Islamic tendencies, which is not going to probably end up very well.
Thank you for your question. I think Nina actually did address that a little bit. She said that many of the minorities actually have looked towards Assad for protection. And so, did you want to just, and then Mike, if you wanted to.
I think at the end of the day, the best we could hope for is regions that are autonomous to some extent, that are ethno-religiously divided. And so you're going to not have, a mix. You're going to have the pluralism, because this is not the age of secularism in the Middle East. We're not seeing, a democratic secular leader rising. So you're going to have this vicious suppression of the religious other or the ethnic other.
So the Assad regime is not a benign element in the Middle East. You've got, Rebeccah said 400,000. I see other estimates that say 500,000 people killed in the war. Most of those people killed are killed by the Assad regime, the Russians and the Iranians. They have destroyed Sunni cities outright, just obliterated them. So it's hard for me to look at the Russian-Iranian Assad complex as good for humanity in any way. The fact that there's a handful of Jews in Tehran that are not being murdered doesn't make me feel good about what the Iranians are doing in the wider Middle East. So that's just with regard to the humanitarian, from the humanitarian point of view. That's from the point of view of the murder machine. Assad, the Iranians, and the Russians have displaced 10 million people or more. That's half the population of Syria. Those people are not going back to their homes. Some of those people have been driven into refugee camps in Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon, and greatly destabilized the entire neighborhood. Those people are going to be in those camps for decades. So we are going to have a ring of hatred in the region as a result of what the Assad regime did. Hundreds of thousands have been pushed into Europe, which has greatly complicated the politics of the European Union and created opportunities for the Russians to destabilize the European Union. So these are humanitarian issues. These are strategic issues. These are moral issues. And then we add to the fact, as I mentioned to begin with, that Iran is out to undermine the United States in the Middle East. Iran has the greatest capabilities of any enemy of the United States in the region. Saudi Arabia does not have a Quds force. Saudi Arabia does not have a Revolutionary Guard. Saudi Arabia is not creating militias in surrounding countries that are destabilizing those countries, murdering people, and holding the governments of those countries hostage, like Iran is doing in Lebanon, like Iran is doing in Yemen, like Iran is doing in Iraq. So I think to sum it all up in one word, I think to say that some Christians, out of no other choice, but have no choice whatsoever, but to bend to the will of the Assad regime, means that somehow we should look with favor upon it is very narrow-minded, very short-sighted.
Sure, we're going to go to the lady behind you first, and then you, and then we'll come over here, and that might be enough, I think.
Much for this important discussion. I just want to start, first of all, my name is Heidi Buzo. I'm a journalist here in Washington, and I want to disagree with the lady in the back. I'm a Syrian Kurdish secular person, and I lived in Syria for years. And I want to point out to one thing, and then I'm going to move on to another point, if that's okay, and just ask a question. We've witnessed, as Kurds, we've been oppressed by the Assad regime. We witnessed the Assad regime supporting Al-Qaeda in Iraq with the Iranian regime. We saw the basically turning a blind eye on ISIS, if not helping ISIS in the beginning, releasing mujahideen from prisons while torturing journalists and Christians to death in the Assad regime prisons. I mean, those are cases that I follow closely. And at the same time, when we talk about the persecution of minority, which is very important, in the genocide that happened with the Yazidis, which are Kurds as well. It's heartbreaking, but at the same time, how can we address this if we have a majority of the Arab Sunnis being slaughtered and basically we don't want to treat that, which was happening by the Assad regime, and to protect only the minority, it just doesn't work if it's not as a part of a bigger solution for just everybody. Another point I just want to talk about, which is, the minority in Syria basically being in control. I think this is another basically source of the situation we have today, because the Alawite regime by Assad is a minority, ruling the majority, which is only oppress the majority and actually help them get radicalized by building only mosques, no schools, not allowing churches to be built, and at the same time, supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria and in Iraq with the Iranian regime. So how could we can address this problem? I mean, we're talking about a regime that is a source for what we see today in terms of radicalization and terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Very well stated.
Does anybody want to add to that, or simply?
Can I say one sentence?
Go for it.
And I don't want to hog the podium, but just in response to the earlier question, I would say that toppling the Assad regime tomorrow would be unwise for the reasons that the questioner stated. But we have to show everyone else in the region that we are going to contain it and that we are going to compete with its Russian and Iranian backers.
I would agree with that as well. And I would also say, I mean, that Nina's points too are well taken. Your question is also well taken. That's why we haven't done so at this, it's why the Trump administration didn't come in and immediately take out Assad. We've got to navigate some of these problems. But anyway, thank you so much for your statement and for being here. Sir, yes.
Thank you. My name is Gerald Heng. I come from Massachusetts, Boston. I think there's general agreement with Mr. Doran's proposition that ISIS is the current world problem because they have violated every rule in the book. And at the same time, it is not only acceptable here that they are the number one problem, but also worldwide. It sort of reminds me of the communist insurgency in Malaysia, where the British had to fight the communist guerrillas. But they fight communist guerrilla successfully because they had a political infrastructure after that. And so the local people took over the government and communism was dead within 12 years. Whereas Uncle Sam was not so good in its Vietnam War. Senator Fulbright said, look, geopolitically, we shouldn't be there. And they tried to get the local people to succeed after the military warfare in Vietnam. But the local leadership was wholly Roman Catholic. So they didn't win. They didn't win. So what I'm asking is this, from the distinguished panelists, is there a psychological, political, infrastructure warfare against ISIS from Uncle Sam's area?
Thank you for your question, sir. I think Nina did address the need for one, certainly.
Well, I think ISIS is going to be history pretty soon, at least as a governing body. The Islamic State will be gone. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Mike said that we have the capability of doing it, and I think President Trump has the desire. It's one of his promises. So the question is then what comes next, and that's sort of what we've been discussing. It's not one threat that we face or that they face. There's the Iran that's filling a vacuum there. That is beginning to feel. I see it very clearly in Nineveh, where they have the militias there already planted there, and they're working with the local Shiite population there, and to empower them. At the same time that other minorities that used to be there are being driven out or can't return.
Radio, TV, newspapers that reach the people who are vulnerable.
Well, the Iran is sending money to empower them, and so and military. So and then there's Al-Qaeda that's going to be reforming in that region again to fill a vacuum for the Sunni population. So it's I think that I don't think the Trump administration wants to keep troops there, but I think they'll have to. I think they'll find they'll have to. And then the question becomes what to do about ISIS in the Sinai or its affiliates in Nigeria and elsewhere. So
We are not going to win because we got all the drones.
well, we definitely have military might, and but it's going to be, some people say intergenerational. It takes a long time.
It's the recruitment that I'm worried about.
Yes. Well, that's what I was talking about, radicalization. It's that we do have to have a counter radicalization plan.
And just to dovetail onto that, how can we recruit or encourage moderate Muslim allies to do some of that work? Because it's not likely to come outside of that community as much. So what role, General Petraeus testifying before Congress a couple weeks ago said one of our number one assets are the millions of moderate Muslims who can be a counter voice to this kind of radicalization. Because a dead terrorist is simply one who's been defeated, not undone. And it's much better to prevent than to kill if necessary.
There's a question over here.
Thank you. Steve Landing, Manchester Trade. I am very frustrated because I hear people coming up with plans, with solutions for an area which does not have an immediate solution. And we have a great habit of eating our allies, as I always say. Saudi Arabia has problems, but it also has 54% of its students are women. There's all kinds of rights, respect for students, not the ones maybe that we like in the West, but they do have special lines. And there's things they do. They could be an ally, but then you go up on the hill and everybody's out to get Saudi Arabia and so on for this reason or that reason and so on. They want to put the refugee ban on. We all know about 9/11. I don't want to go there. But so when you talk about who our allies are going to be, I don't know who they are exactly and so on. I think the question, and then when you keep talking about like the red line worked. President Osama, my life. But the president Obama knew that we didn't have the military might to do it. He knew they used poison gas. He got the Russians to get it out. They did a little bit more, but they haven't done much. I don't know how much. I don't know the intelligence. They haven't done much. He got it out. He did it within his very limited power of a country doesn't want to go there. So the real question I'm asking you all is to say, we know the long-term trends is towards secularism. It makes sense. And there's young people, and we all know about the cell phones everyone uses and the social media, a lot of the jazz. But what is the solution? How do we not try to choose sides, but how do we reach out to the, quote, young people? Everybody lives in a village. How do we go there? Because I don't think the way we're going to do it is by either liking Mr. Assad or not. Because I think you were very clear. We can't get rid of him. We may not like him. Maybe it was a mistake to say that our real goal was to get rid of him. That's all past. But is there some kind of, and I think this is the question you were asking as far as Malaysia goes, is there some kind of a message not to solve the problem immediately, but we can be on the trend to getting the problem solved? Thank you.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative just for a moment here and just to respond to one particular point you made, which was that after Assad crossed President Obama's red line, and actually he had used chemical weapons multiple times. Whenever the red line was officially announced to have been crossed, it had been crossed. But then we did come up, President Obama did come up with this solution. Actually, it was Putin's idea to go in and work with the United States to send in the OPCW to remove chemical weapons from Syria. The OPCW is not like the IAEA. The OPCW is there at the invitation of the nation's leader, that was Assad. So Assad showed the OPCW which weapons he was happy to give up, which means the chemical weapons he was not happy to give up are still there. It also means that subsequently he weaponized chlorine, which was not covered by the deal because it can be used in other things, cleaning, keeping your swimming pool clean, et cetera. It's a common use. So it has been weaponized and used at least twice to have been officially known by the Assad regime, we believe, because they're the ones with the helicopters and dropping barrel bombs on people. And of course, the weaponization of chlorine is especially awful to children and to the elderly. It is a terror weapon. So, that point I couldn't let slide because it isn't. I mean, what President Obama did is he was backed into a corner because he realized he didn't have a plan or a strategy, and so Congress wouldn't authorize the use of force and to go and enforce that red line. So that's where we are today with Assad in that deal. But did anybody else want to address the rest of the question that he had asked, or?
Just an observation that there is no solution. We're not going to have a solution to the Middle East, to the conflicts. The question is, how do we manage the chaos better? And then I would just return to what I said. We have to figure out who our allies are and who they aren't, and that's not as hard a question as it looks. If we ask the question, which states in the region can live comfortably with an American hegemony and which can't, I think they sort themselves out very quickly.
That's a great point.
The one comment I have is that I do agree that we can't make the perfect the enemy of the good enough, right? Guys like me who are full of idealism and realism too, but full of ideals, and I want peace to be characterized by the presence of order and justice. Damn it! And if I don't, let's get it. That kind of thing. Guys like me have to recognize that at least in most cases, while order with justice is to be preferred, order without justice is probably better than anarchy. And there might be exceptions to that, but that might be a general rule worth thinking about before we go in seeking justice and end up neither with justice nor order, which could be problematic as well, right?
I would also say, keep your eye on Iraq. There's a glimmer of hope for Iraq. I think that there's more to work with there. There's a government that seems to be an improvement over the past government, not only Saddam Hussein, but the Maliki government. And they're not as sectarian there as Maliki was. The Sunnis seem to have be welcoming this liberation for the most part. We'll see. I mean, it's going to be a rough road ahead, but many of them seem to be celebrating the liberation of their city from ISIS. The Kurds are in, they have established a de facto autonomy, or not autonomy, in sort of a de facto state almost. And it's, we'll see how the smallest minorities, the genocide-targeted minorities, survive. They may not survive there. But it is a wealthy country, even despite the fact that ISIS has controlled about a third of it. Its economy has grown. So I think that, that's something to work with and to build on. And I think that the minorities could survive if the U.S. military presence is maintained and we don't see the encroachment of Iran and the Sunni response to that through Al-Qaeda. So
I'm going to take actually one last question here. The gentleman with right there.
Vincent LaFaso, freelance writer. On Wednesday, the United States military announced the deployment of hundreds of Marines to Syria. And just recently, they've also announced 2,500 paratroopers to Kuwait to contain ISIS in Iraq and Syria. My biggest concern would be a direct confrontation between U.S. troops and Iran or Russia proxies, Free Syrian Army troops. Can we learn the lessons of Vietnam back in the 70s or something? But my question is, what will be how important would the deployment of U.S. troops be, and what are the biggest challenges we can overcome to be a broker for peace, especially to the innocent civilians who've been losing their lives every day from bombs and drones? How can we help in that? Thank you.
Respond to the presence of troops that are there.
So the troops are. This is a prelude to the campaign in Raqqa, and the troops are interposing themselves between the Turks and the Kurds. The Obama administration strategy, which the Trump administration has inherited, calls for using the Kurds to take Raqqa, but they recognize that you can't hold that will alienate the Sunni Arab population of Raqqa if you have Kurds come in and take it. So they have created underneath the Kurdish umbrella some Syrian Arab forces, Sunni forces that will take the city. The problem here is that it's alienating the Turks because the Turks believe, I think correctly, that the Syrian Kurds with whom we're working are the Syrian extension of the PKK. So we're giving strategic depth to the Kurds who want to separatism in Turkey. So there's a debate going on in our government between those who want us to find a way to mollify the Turks and those that have other ideas like aligning with the Russians and the Iranians on the ground. When this debate is going to be sorted out, I don't know, and then how it's going to unfold over time, I don't know, because we find ourselves mediating between these different groups. That's why I've been putting the emphasis on the larger strategic idea. I don't think any of the other questions that we have, humanitarian, ethnic groups, and so on, can be possibly adjudicated if we don't have the larger strategic concept for the region first.
Did anybody else want to?
Well, that also goes back to, having those Marines and the Army Raiders that are the Army Rangers, Marine Raiders, I guess it is, trying to keep the peace between the Turks and the Kurds is an example of why it's a false analysis to say that, that Trump is going to let them all kill each other. That's definitely not happening. That's, I think... I don't know how long we could be a referee like that, but at least at this critical moment when we're about to lead this, or not lead, but participate in this attack on Raqqa and wipe out ISIS is important.
Just to emphasize Mike's point that, you need the strategic plan in place, especially for sending troops in harm's way. I've never met a service member yet who refuses to have their lives spent, but I've met many who are offended at their being wasted. And if you don't have the strategy in place, tend toward the one rather than the other.
I'll just add to General Mattis made the argument before he became the nominee for the Secretary of Defense that this idea that we've just, for the first time in the history of humanity, that we've come to a problem that cannot be solved is just not true. That it will be hard, it'll be complicated, but we could take a really hard problem and come up with a solution that's better, that is better for American security and also handles the moral and ethical questions the best we can, if imperfectly. And with that, would you please join me in thanking our panelists? Thank you.
Thank you.